Blink and you'll miss it. It's the FTG TIKITAKA T16. Just kidding, it's the D16. This is the T16, but they look very, very similar indeed, and we're going to look at both of these leverless controllers today. At roughly $130 and $230 respectively, these controllers may look very similar, but they've got very subtle differences like button feel, RGB lighting, and more. Is the price just right, or should you be upgrading to the slightly more premium version with this aluminium frame? Let's jump straight into some gameplay and find out. Now, these controllers were sent to me for the purposes of making this video, but I haven't been instructed to say anything specific about them. I don't have to send it back at the end, and all opinions are my own. Alright, as you can see, I've got Street Fighter 6 loaded up here with the TIKITAKA T16, or is it? Just kidding, it's the D16, and it looks very, very similar. It's the T16. Now, I'm going to go into detail about both of these controllers, but remember, I have a separate video which covers all of my thoughts on these cheap leverless controllers in a separate video, so you absolutely want to make sure you check that one out as well. For now, the basics are we have the directions over here, we have the 8 action buttons, but we also have these extra buttons, and this is the same on both controllers. We have a button over here, left of the jump button, we have a button over here, right of the jump button, and we also have an extra button above the row of punch buttons over here, which I've set to simple throw macro. In terms of button size and layout, it's very similar to the S15. It's got similarly sized buttons. I believe these are kind of 20mm and 24mm buttons for the main action buttons, and this one jump button in the middle. Everything I've mentioned so far is similar on the D16, but a crucial difference to the S15, all the buttons are here in the middle of the controller. Personally, I'm fine with either, but I do think there are some benefits for split layouts and other benefits for having all the buttons right here in the middle of the controller. Plenty of palm space if you like to play at a desk. Perhaps the first thing you'll notice when you start using this controller is that actually it has textured buttons. These are 3D printed buttons, and they've got quite a scratchy texture to them. They don't hurt or anything. You can see they use the regular Kale low profile Chalk V1 switches in here. Finding button caps that fit for these switches is a little bit harder to find than for just the standard plus stems that you get on regular MX switches. But the other thing about this controller is that it does have rims built in to access the button switches themselves, and to even change them out, you don't need to open up the controller. You can just pull the switch out like this and slide in different ones. You can see that the button casing comes straight out. It's not locked in place or anything. I don't know if it's supposed to be, but it is actually just loose right here. So it's kind of unusual that the key switch actually has the secondary job of holding the button casing in place. Now, as far as I'm aware, there's no way to actually configure these buttons without going into the web configurator. Again, the details are in my separate video. Just be aware that, like the S15, you are under the same risks of all the TIKITAKA controllers, which is that if you reset any of the firmware, the controller becomes actually completely unusable. You have to email TIKITAKA. As far as I'm aware, the homepage hasn't been created yet, so you have to email them and wait for them to send you the new firmware so you can flash that, and then you need to add the extra firmware on top of that, which is specific to the TIKITAKA, and then your controller will be back to the way it was. But you have to be very careful when you're changing button layouts, because, for example, if you actually unassign the start button, apparently you won't be able to get back into the GP configurator software, and then you're stuck, and then you have to email the company and get all that stuff sorted out. The controller itself is nice and slim. As you can see, it's very similar to the S15, and in fact, it has 3 ports, one on the right, one on the top, and one on the left, and supposedly you can use any of these ports to plug in for control. It does work with the right side. Kind of convenient to have access through any of the 3 ports. So mechanically speaking, there's really very little to complain about with this controller, because the buttons do exactly what I would expect. They feel quite nice, so they don't feel heavy or clunky or anything. Can't complain about the Kale key switches, always been a big fan of them. The left extra button and the right extra button are slightly offset. As you can see, this one is a little bit closer to the action buttons, but that kind of makes sense because some people may be doing, I don't know, option selects or various things where these main fingers over here are being used to press this button. Personally, I just use my thumb so I can use it for drive rush. I don't have a very complicated way of using these extra buttons, and being able to access drive impact with my left thumb over here, always very nice for those quick reaction moments where I need to bust that out. So essentially that is all the good stuff about the T16. The D16 comes in at $100 more, almost $100 more, at $224, and let's see what you get. The main thing you'll notice when you plug in the D16 rather than the T16 is flashing lights. So for $100 extra, $224, we have what looks like the same controller before it's turned on, but when you turn it on, the main differences become more apparent. It has RGB lights, which you can actually change if I hold select and start at the same time. Phase between all of the different colors, from green to blue to whatever color comes after blue. I can't remember the rainbow song. It actually has an aluminium frame going around the whole controller. If you didn't like the look of the T16, which shows you all of the layers of plastic that are holding this together with the PCB right here in the middle layer, you can go for the D16, which has this aluminium frame all around. It's a bit like an iPhone 4. Kind of an interesting design choice, because now that we've got RGB, I actually would have preferred to be able to see the sides of the controller, because then I could have the lights shining through. But for whatever reason, they've decided they only want the RGB to be peeking through these gaps between the button caps and the button surrounds. The screws are no longer on the surface of the controller. That being said, on the base of the controller, these screws are exactly the same as before. They still jut out of the base. These are a necessity. It has less texture on the buttons. They're still textured 3D printed buttons, but they don't have a rough feel to them. They feel like they've been, I don't know, polished, or maybe they've gone through a different process. And it says on the website it makes them easier to plink. It makes no difference in my opinion, but it is a nice little upgrade if you were not happy with the texture of the buttons on the T16. So those are the main features of the T16 and the D16, but there are a number of areas where I think these controllers have a lot of work to do in order to improve. So let's have a look. First up, let's start with the T16. Although they're very similar controllers, it is a shame that these screws are jutting out the top. But I just think that even the base models, it would be nice if these screws weren't jutting out the top. Probably most concerning thing about these controllers is that when you've plugged them in, you can see that they're, unlike the S15, they do have screens on the D16 and the T16, but this is as sharp as the screen gets. And as you can see, I can't read the text at all. I know that it's supposed to say X input. There's no way to know what it actually says. And I thought maybe this is just some sort of manufacturing issue. But when I plugged it into the D16 as well, which is, remember, this controller is $100 more than the T16. As you can see, if I zoom in the camera on this one as well, it's exactly the same. You really just can't see through this screen. They've gone for like a frosted plexiglass look on the top, which is kind of nice. I don't know if it's really helping with fingerprints, because it does still pick up fingerprints quite a lot. But as you can see, on both the D16 and the T16, this screen is completely illegible. The next thing I want to point out is that I'm not a big fan of the scratchy texture on here. The next issue, which I've kind of mentioned before, is that if you want this controller to be tournament legal, you have to go into the web configurator and change some settings yourself. Because as you can see, up at the moment is here, and up is also down here. And I think you're not allowed to have two separate up buttons for the controller to be tournament legal. Again, you'll have to double check the most current versions of the rules, but as far as I'm aware, that's not allowed. So you'll have to go into the configurator and change that. But also, what's really weird is that instead of setting this to L3, R3, and touchpad for these extra buttons, they've actually set this button to be the left shoulder button. And as you can see here, we've got the left shoulder button here, and we've got a left shoulder button over here, which means we've got two left shoulder buttons set by default. Now, this next issue might actually be a problem for all GP2040 controllers, but they've got a set shortcut for changing the SOCD modes. And on the controller, you have to press the home and the start and the up button, and then that would supposedly change you to up priority mode. But as you can see, it hasn't actually worked for me, so I don't know if it's just this controller, but it hasn't worked for me. But secondly, the issue with that is that when you press the home and the start button, it opens up weird shortcuts in Windows, and presumably, I don't know, pressing the home button when you're on a console as well is also just going to bring up the home menu, and it's just kind of confusing. I think it would be much nicer if there were a dedicated button over here that helped me change the SOCD modes, or maybe some kind of switcher. Whatever it was, I wasn't able to change the SOCD modes. Now, the control panel is labeled. I'm a big fan of that, but like most of these cheap leverless controllers, they just use a tiny small collection of buttons over here for things like the touchpad. Personally, I think something like touchpad or select would be much nicer if that were a huge button where I could press it really easily, because definitely you're going to be wanting to use that to reset the stage in games like Street Fighter 6 when you want to do your combos. Just like, oh, I fluffed up the combo, let me just press the select button and reset the stage. But something I will say is that these buttons are nice and easy to press, and they don't hurt at all because they've got a nice big surface area. Now, if I just bring the D16 back for a moment, it's really quite difficult to know which controller is which, but this is almost double the price of this one. And I feel like at double the price, you should be getting like double the number of features, but instead we're just getting the buttons that I think should have been included on the original one anyway. We're getting rid of those screws on the top, which I think shouldn't have been in the original one anyway. I'm not sure if this aluminum frame is really helping. It does give it a slightly more premium feel, and it makes the controller a little weightier, which is nice, but again, I don't know if that's warranting the extra cost, really. Something that seems kind of strange to me on the D16 is that you have these super bright spots. You can actually see the God rays coming out of these lights on the camera at the moment. And it's because there's no like plastic cover. They shine right through the gap on the key, which means that you can see the lights, but you've got bright spots, and it's actually kind of painful on the eye looking directly at LEDs. So I don't know, it's got RGB, but it shines directly in your eye. It's kind of painful, and in the end, I think I'd end up just kind of switching it off. And finally, there was one issue that maybe only affects my unit, but I actually couldn't get into the web configurator for this, the D16. Presumably, for other versions of the D16, they are working, and I assume if you email them, you can get that fixed. But currently, there is no homepage, so there's no way to just like download the file and get it all set up yourself. You have to kind of contact them and wait for them to reply to you to fix it. But to be perfectly transparent, on the unit that they sent to me out of the box, I could not use the web configurator. Even if I hold start and plug in the USB and type in the correct code, it still didn't get me in there. There's a mysterious button on the back that looks like a reset button of sorts, but I pressed that and that also didn't fix the issue. Now, this is something I mentioned in the S15 video as well, but something about these FTG TIKITAKA controllers is that because they don't have a homepage set up yet, in order to get things fixed and solved, you have to kind of email them directly and wait for files to be sent to you individually, and that doesn't seem like a very effective way of getting these issues solved. So if you do have a problem with the controller, you're kind of at the mercy of the company. Hopefully they just email you back in time. So just to summarize my thoughts here on the T16 and D16, they're more or less the same controller, but one is double the price of the other one. Now, it does have RGB built into the D16, but it's not kind of my favorite way of implementing RGB, and it has these bright spots that get in my eye. So honestly, personally, if I had to choose between one or the other, I'd probably choose the T16 because there aren't really that many benefits that are like necessary on the D16. It does have slightly smoother buttons, so it's tempting to want to upgrade to this one just for the smoother buttons. But functionally, this controller does kind of everything it needs to do. I've got access to GP2040 firmware. I've got all the buttons you could possibly ask for. They do need to be set up so that they're actually tournament legal, because out of the box you won't be allowed to be playing in tournaments with the current setup that they come with. And as long as you're not relying on this OLED for anything important because it's super blurry and unreadable, the actual controller itself is functionally okay, it does the job, and all the buttons are in the right place, and it feels kind of nice to use. But that being said, there are a number of concerns, like the fact that you have to email the company to get things sorted out. The D16 model that was sent to me actually couldn't access the web configurator, so I'm stuck. I can't actually use this in a tournament unless I can actually get the file from them via email. But other than those things, functionally, kind of gets the job done. Well, that's pretty much it for the FTG TIKITAKA T16 and D16. Hopefully this video has helped you make a decision as to whether you should buy the cheaper version that has pretty much everything on it, or if you should spend a little bit extra and go for the D16 version. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to click the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and check out this video next if you love fighting games, controllers, and all that great stuff. I've been NihongoGamer. I'll see you real soon.